Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the Missouri Ozarks. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the shadow of the rolling Ozark Mountains, where pine forests whisper secrets long forgotten, there was a name that once caused doors to close and conversations to hush: Emma Hall. Today, her story remains buried in courthouse archives, newspaper microfiche, and the fading memories of those whose grandparents spoke her name only in whispers. What follows is a compilation of records, testimonies, and documents spanning nearly 7 decades, carefully pieced together from what remains of one of the most disturbing cases in Missouri history. The year was 1895. Spring had just begun to touch the rugged landscape of the eastern Ozarks when Dr. James Wilson stood before the Shannon County Sheriff with a disturbing claim. Henry Hall, one of the region's most prosperous landowners, was being slowly poisoned to death, and the doctor believed the culprit was Hall's wife of 4 years, Emma. What followed would uncover a trail of death stretching back 15 years and across hundreds of miles, a methodical campaign of murder that claimed 9 lives and would have continued had fate not intervened in the form of a European-trained physician who recognized the telltale signs of arsenic poisoning. But to understand the case of Emma Hall, we must begin much earlier, with a quiet child born into a troubled family in Taney County, Missouri. The first thing most people noticed about Emma Blackwell as she was born was her remarkable composure. Even as a child, according to church records from the small community of Taney County, she possessed an unnerving stillness. The local minister noted in his personal journal from 1870 that the Blackwell girl watches rather than plays, observes rather than participates. This observation would prove prophetic in ways the good Reverend could never have imagined. Emma's family lived modestly on the outskirts of Forsyth, the county seat of Taney County. Her father, Thomas Blackwell, worked as a blacksmith, while her mother tended to their small home and garden. According to county records, the family kept to themselves, rarely participating in community gatherings. Neighbors described the Blackwell home as unnaturally quiet, even with 3 children living there. Emma was the middle child with an older brother, James, and a younger sister, Mary. The Blackwell family attended the local Methodist church irregularly, and when they did, they would arrive just as the service began and leave immediately afterward, avoiding the social interactions that typically followed worship. This behavior, while noted as unusual, was not considered alarming in a community where privacy was respected and family matters were considered strictly private affairs. Emma's early education came from the one-room schoolhouse in Forsyth. School records, preserved in the County Historical Society, show her to have been an above-average student, particularly adept at mathematics and reading. Her teacher, Miss Sarah Holcomb, noted in her annual assessments that Emma possessed a keen mind and remarkable memory, but also observed that she keeps to herself and forms no close attachments with other children. The first indication that something might be amiss in the Blackwell household came in the winter of 1875, when Emma was just 15. Miss Holcomb's notes mention that Emma arrived at school with bruises on her arms on multiple occasions. When questioned, she reportedly said, "Father believes in firm guidance." The teacher noted her concern, but, as was common at the time, did not intervene in what was considered a family matter. What few knew was that Thomas Blackwell's guidance extended beyond physical discipline. According to a distant relative interviewed in 1960, Thomas treated his son James with a measure of respect, but viewed his daughters as little more than property. Emma's mother, Elizabeth, offered little protection, having been worn down by years of similar treatment. The household functioned under a code of silence. What happened within those walls was never to be discussed outside. A neighbor, Mrs. Eleanor Jenkins, recalled in a statement given to researchers in 1960 that she once heard terrible shouting from the Blackwell home, followed by the sound of breaking glass. The next day, she observed Emma in the garden, her face bruised, but her demeanor as composed as ever. When Mrs. Jenkins inquired about the disturbance, Emma simply replied, "Father had a disagreement with the furniture. It's been resolved." The matter was never mentioned again. Perhaps it was this early education in silence and secrets that shaped Emma's later methodology. She learned young that quiet suffering often went unnoticed, that maintaining appearances mattered more than reality, and that those in authority rarely questioned what happened behind closed doors so long as public decorum was maintained. In 1878, when Emma was 18, her mother died suddenly of what was recorded as brain fever, a vague diagnosis common at the time that could have encompassed anything from meningitis to a stroke. There were whispers in the community that Elizabeth Blackwell's death might have been hastened by her husband's treatment, but no investigation was conducted. Emma's younger sister Mary was sent to live with an aunt in Springfield, but Emma remained in the household with her father and brother. For the next 2 years, according to sparse records and later recollections from neighbors, Emma essentially ran the Blackwell household. She cooked, cleaned, and managed the domestic affairs with the same quiet efficiency that would later characterize her more sinister activities. Her father's drinking reportedly worsened during this period, but Emma never complained or sought help from the community. By 1880, Emma had grown into a striking young woman. Photographs from this period show a tall, slender figure with dark hair and remarkably penetrating eyes. Those who knew her described her as handsome rather than pretty, with a certain intensity that some found appealing and others disturbing. It was during this year that Emma met her first husband, William Cooper, a cattle trader passing through the region. Cooper was in Forsyth to purchase stock from local farmers and stayed at the town's only hotel for several weeks. According to accounts from the hotel proprietor, later published in the Taney County Republican, after Emma's arrest, Cooper first noticed Emma at the general store, where she was purchasing supplies for the Blackwell household. He apparently found her self-sufficiency and composure attractive, and began to seek opportunities to encounter her around town. Their courtship was brief. County marriage records show they wed in April 1880, when Emma was 20 years old. Cooper was considerably older, nearly 40, and according to local gossip recorded in various personal diaries of the time, the match raised eyebrows. Why would a young woman from a modest background marry a man old enough to be her father? What many didn't know was that Emma's home life had deteriorated. Her father's drinking, according to sparse medical records from the local doctor, had increased, as had his violence toward his family. William Cooper represented escape. He owned land near White River, approximately 17 miles from Forsyth, and promised Emma a new beginning. The couple moved to Cooper's property shortly after their wedding. Neighbors rarely saw them together in town. When Emma did appear, she came alone to purchase supplies, always polite but never lingering to chat. According to statements given decades later by Elizabeth Tanner, whose farm bordered Cooper's property, there was something odd about the couple's dynamic from the beginning. She never looked at him the way a new bride should, Tanner recalled in a 1960 interview preserved in the Taney County Historical Society. When they were together in public, which wasn't often, she seemed to be studying him, like she was taking notes on his behavior. I remember thinking at the time that it wasn't natural, but folks minded their own business back then. Cooper's property was relatively isolated, situated in a bend of the White River with dense forest on 3 sides. The nearest neighbor was over a mile away, and the road to town was often impassable during heavy rains. This isolation meant that, for months at a time, Emma and William Cooper lived with virtually no outside contact. What transpired during these periods, only Emma would ever know. 6 months after their wedding, William Cooper was dead. The official cause, as listed in county death records dated October 1880, was heart failure. Given Cooper's age and the remote nature of their home, No one questioned the death too deeply. Emma, now a widow at 21, inherited Cooper's modest property and livestock. She sold most of the cattle and kept to herself on the isolated property. The doctor who attended Cooper's death, Dr. Franklin Pierce, noted in his personal records that he found nothing overtly suspicious about the death, though he was called only after Cooper had already passed. Emma explained that her husband had complained of chest pains for several days but refused to seek medical attention. According to Dr. Pierce's notes, the body showed no unusual signs, and given Cooper's age and apparent health issues, a verdict of natural causes seemed reasonable. What is notable in retrospect is how perfectly Emma played the role of the grieving widow. Dr. Pierce described her as appropriately distraught but remarkably composed, noting that she had already prepared the body for examination and had Cooper's affairs in order, including the location of his will and financial papers. This combination of emotional control and practical efficiency would characterize her behavior following each of her husband's deaths. What followed would establish a pattern so consistent, so methodical, that it defies coincidence. Yet for decades, no one connected the dots scattered across multiple counties, states, and years. Emma's story wasn't just about one death, or even two. It was about 9 men who married her, and 9 men who died under circumstances that, individually, raised few alarms, but collectively paint a portrait of calculated horror. Emma remained on Cooper's property for approximately 6 months after his death. During this time, according to local merchant ledgers preserved in the county archives, she made regular purchases of books on finance and property management, unusual reading for a young widow in rural Missouri at that time. She also, records show, began corresponding with banks in Springfield, the largest nearby city. In the spring of 1881, Emma sold Cooper's property to a neighboring farmer for what local records indicate was a fair price. She packed her belongings and moved to Springfield, a city that offered both anonymity and opportunity. There she rented a small but respectable room in a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Abigail Thornton. According to later statements from Mrs. Thornton, Emma arrived with several trunks of possessions and immediately established herself as a woman of quiet refinement, though she revealed very little about her past beyond mentioning that she was a recent widow. Emma's second husband was Joseph Miller, a shopkeeper from Springfield whom she met while selling some of Cooper's remaining possessions in 1881. Miller owned a moderately successful dry goods store on the town's main street and was known in the community as a respectable businessman, though not particularly wealthy. He was a widower himself, his wife having died in childbirth several years earlier, along with their infant. At 45, Miller had resigned himself to a solitary life until he encountered Emma. Miller was charmed by the young widow's self-sufficiency and quiet demeanor. They married in December of that year, and Emma relocated to Miller's modest home behind his store. Miller's dry goods store provided a comfortable living, and for nearly a year the couple appeared to live contentedly. One of Miller's regular customers, a Mrs. Eliza Thornton, later recalled that Emma took an active interest in the business, learning the accounting and operations with surprising speed. She was always at that ledger book, Thornton said in an account published in the Springfield News Leader in 1895 after Emma's arrest. Mr. Miller seemed pleased at first to have such a helpful wife, but I remember once, maybe a month before he died, he mentioned that she'd been asking a lot of questions about his will and insurance. He laughed it off, said she was just being practical. The store clerk, a young man named Thomas Barker, noted in his statement to authorities that Emma began to take a more active role in the business around 6 months into the marriage. She insisted on handling the store's finances and began making decisions about inventory and suppliers. Miller, according to Barker, seemed content with this arrangement, telling friends that his wife had a head for numbers that exceeded his own. In November 1882, Joseph Miller died after a short but severe illness. The doctor's report, still preserved in Greene County records, cited severe gastric distress as the cause of death. Miller had no family in the area to raise questions, and Emma, once again widowed, inherited his store and modest savings. She sold the business within 3 months and disappeared from Springfield. Dr. Howard Jenkins, who attended Miller during his final illness, later told investigators that he had suspected at the time that something was amiss. Mr. Miller's symptoms were unusual: severe stomach pain, vomiting, unusual thirst, and a peculiar garlic odor to his breath. Had I been more familiar with the effects of arsenic, I might have recognized the signs. As it was, I attributed his condition to severe food poisoning, or perhaps a perforated ulcer. What Dr. Jenkins did find strange was Emma's behavior during her husband's illness. She nursed him diligently, preparing all his meals and medicines herself, but there was a detachment to her care. She spoke of his symptoms with an almost clinical interest, noting changes and progression, as one might observe a scientific experiment rather than a beloved spouse in distress. Records show that by early 1883, Emma had surfaced in Joplin, a booming mining town in the southwestern corner of Missouri. With the proceeds from the sale of Miller's store, she purchased a small boarding house near the center of town, catering to the more respectable mine managers and clerks rather than the common miners. This business venture provided her with both income and social connections in her new community. It was through the boarding house that she met Thomas Grant, a successful mine supervisor with significant holdings in the local lead and zinc operations. Grant was a widower himself, with 2 grown children living in St. Louis. He was 53, considerably older than Emma, but well respected in the community and financially secure. He initially took a room at Emma's boarding house while overseeing the opening of a new mine shaft, but soon became a regular visitor, even after moving to his own home on the outskirts of town. Grant was apparently quite taken with the young widow, impressed by her business acumen and seeming devotion to her late husband's memories. The couple married in April 1883, and Emma moved into Grant's substantial home on the outskirts of town, leaving the boarding house in the care of a manager. According to an interview conducted in 1960 with Grant's housekeeper, preserved in the Joplin Historical Society archives, Emma transformed after the wedding. Mrs. Grant kept to herself mostly, spent hours in her room writing in journals no one was allowed to touch. Mr. Grant seemed happy enough at first, but after a few months, I noticed he looked tired all the time, pale. When I suggested he might see a doctor, Mrs. Grant dismissed me for the day, saying she would care for him herself. The housekeeper, Mary Sullivan, also noted that Emma began to take charge of all household matters, including meals. She insisted on preparing Mr. Grant's evening tea herself, said it was a special blend that would help with his digestion. After he started drinking it regular, that's when the decline began, slow at first, but steady. According to Sullivan, Grant's health deteriorated over the course of several months. He became increasingly weak, complained of stomach pains, and lost weight noticeably. Yet Emma discouraged him from seeking medical attention, insisting that his condition was merely temporary exhaustion from his work at the mines. When he finally did consult a doctor, Emma always accompanied him, answering many of the physician's questions herself. In January 1884, Thomas Grant died in his sleep. The cause was listed as natural decline, though he was only 53 years old. His children arrived for the funeral, and, according to local newspaper accounts, there was tension between them and their father's new wife. However, Grant's will, updated shortly after his marriage, left the bulk of his estate to Emma, with only small portions going to his children. Grant's son, William, attempted to contest the will, suggesting that his father's mental faculties had been compromised during his final months. Court records show that the challenge was dismissed due to lack of evidence. What's notable is that William Grant specifically mentioned his suspicions about his father's rapid decline after marrying Emma, but without modern forensic techniques, there was no way to prove foul play. After settling her late husband's affairs, Emma once again relocated, this time to Kansas City, a much larger urban center where she could reinvent herself completely. Using the substantial funds inherited from Thomas Grant, she established herself in a fashionable neighborhood and began to move in more affluent social circles. She joined the Ladies' Aid Society at one of the city's prominent churches and became known for hosting small but elegant afternoon teas. The pattern continued. Emma moved to Kansas City with her newfound wealth and, within 6 months, had married George Bennett, a banker 20 years her senior. Bennett was a widower with grown children who lived out of state. He held a senior position at the Merchants National Bank and owned a stately home in a prestigious neighborhood. Their courtship was brief, but conducted with propriety, with Bennett proposing after knowing Emma for just 3 months. Bennett died in December 1884 after falling down the stairs of their home while Emma was reportedly visiting a friend. No witnesses saw the fall. The medical examiner noted that Bennett had alcohol in his system, which could explain the accident. Emma inherited his considerable estate. A housemaid employed by the Bennetts later told investigators that she had never known Mr. Bennett to drink heavily before his marriage to Emma. She also mentioned that on the night of his death, she had prepared tea for both Mr. and Mrs. Bennett before Emma went out to visit her friend. The maid noticed that Mr. Bennett seemed unusually disoriented after finishing his tea, but thought little of it until after his death. The pattern established with Bennett would repeat itself with remarkable consistency over the next decade. By 1886, Emma had married and buried Jacob Thornton, a cattle baron from the western edge of Missouri. By 1887, she had done the same with Edward Davis, a hotel owner from Hannibal. In each case, the deaths were attributed to either illness or accident. In each case, Emma was the primary beneficiary, and in each case she moved on quickly, establishing herself in a new community where her history was unknown. During this period, according to bank records uncovered during the later investigation, Emma's financial strategy became increasingly sophisticated. She established accounts in multiple institutions, often in different names: Emma Cooper, Emma Miller, Emma Grant, and so on. She invested in property, stocks, and bonds, showing a financial acumen unusual for a woman of that era, particularly one with no formal education in such matters. A bank manager in St. Louis, interviewed after Emma's arrest, described her as the most methodical woman I've ever encountered. He noted that she kept meticulous records of all transactions and seemed to have an instinctive understanding of how to move money in ways that attracted minimal attention. She never withdrew large sums at once, he recalled, always just enough to live comfortably, with the bulk of her fortune carefully invested and dispersed across multiple institutions. What makes this case particularly disturbing is not just the consistent pattern of death that followed Emma Hall, but the calculated way in which she selected her victims and managed her affairs. According to bank records examined during a 1940 investigation, Emma maintained separate accounts in different banks across the state. She never flaunted her wealth, living modestly despite having amassed a considerable fortune through her successive marriages. Each of Emma's husbands fit a specific profile: older, established men with significant assets, few or distant family connections, and respectable standing in their communities. These weren't men who would be easily forgotten, but neither were they surrounded by close family who might question the circumstances of their deaths too deeply. Emma's selection process showed a predator's instinct for identifying the vulnerable, despite their outward appearance of security and respectability. By 1888, Emma had married her 7th husband, Charles Wilson, a respected doctor from Jefferson City. This marriage lasted slightly longer than the others, nearly 2 years. During this time, according to Wilson's colleagues interviewed decades later, the doctor became increasingly reclusive. He stopped attending medical society meetings and reduced his patient load significantly. In March 1890, Wilson died after what was described as a wasting illness of unknown origin. As a doctor, Wilson had kept detailed notes about his symptoms, but these notes mysteriously disappeared after his death. Emma, once again, inherited everything: doctor. Wilson's former colleague, Dr. James Cartwright, later recalled a disturbing conversation he had with Wilson approximately 1 month before his death. Charles confided that he suspected he was being poisoned, Cartwright told investigators. He'd been monitoring his own symptoms, and they aligned with arsenic exposure. But when I asked if he suspected his wife, he laughed it off, said Emma was the only one caring for him. I suggested he have some food samples tested, but he never did, at least not that I know of. I often wonder if he confronted her, and that hastened the end. Wilson's death marked a turning point in Emma's methodology. Having married and presumably murdered a doctor who had begun to suspect poisoning, she appears to have refined her techniques. Her subsequent husbands died more quickly and with less protracted illness, suggesting she had learned from the Wilson case that allowing a victim to linger too long increased the risk of detection. Husband number 8 was Robert Taylor, a judge from St. Louis, whom Emma met while finalizing some legal matters related to Wilson's estate. They married in October 1890, and by April 1891, Judge Taylor was dead. The official cause was food poisoning from tainted meat, though Taylor was the only one affected, despite Emma having allegedly eaten the same meal. A courthouse clerk who knew Judge Taylor well later stated that the judge had seemed in perfect health until his marriage to Emma. He was robust, full of energy, the clerk recalled in a statement to police. But within months of the wedding he began to look haggard. His hands shook. He'd forget things. All of us noticed, but he brushed off our concerns, said his wife was taking good care of him. What's particularly notable about the Taylor case is the speed with which Emma disposed of his assets after his death. Within 6 weeks, she had sold his house, liquidated most of his investments, and moved on. This efficiency suggests a woman who had refined her process through experience, knowing exactly how to manage not just the murder itself, but the aftermath as well. The 9th and final husband was Henry Hall, a wealthy landowner from the eastern Ozarks region. They married in July 1891 and for nearly 4 years lived together on Hall's expansive property near the Current River in Shannon County. This was Emma's longest marriage and, according to local accounts, seemed different from the others. They were seen together frequently in the nearby town of Eminence, and Emma appeared to have settled into the role of a respected landowner's wife. What wasn't visible to the community was the careful groundwork Emma had laid. According to later testimony from Hall's lawyer, Emma had insisted on a detailed prenuptial agreement that granted her full ownership of the property in the event of Hall's death. She had also convinced Hall to distance himself from his few remaining relatives, citing past disagreements that Hall himself had apparently forgotten or minimized. The Hall property was one of the most substantial in Shannon County, encompassing over 2,000 acres of timber and farmland, with a stately main house that had been in the Hall family for 2 generations. The estate included several tenant farms, a sawmill, and significant frontage on the Current River, known for its pristine beauty and abundant fishing. For Emma, it represented not just wealth, but a kind of permanence and respectability that her previous marriages had not provided. According to servants employed at the Hall estate, Emma initially seemed content in her role as mistress of the property. She oversaw the household staff efficiently, entertained local dignitaries with appropriate hospitality, and accompanied her husband on his regular inspection tours of the tenant farms. To all outward appearances, the marriage was successful, and Emma had finally found a permanent place in society. In March 1895, however, Henry Hall became ill. Unlike Emma's previous husbands, Hall did not die quickly. His illness lingered for weeks, with symptoms that puzzled the local doctor. According to medical records preserved from the time, Hall experienced progressive weakness, stomach pain, and hair loss. The doctor, James Wilson, no relation to Emma's 7th husband, had recently returned from medical training in Europe and was familiar with the symptoms of arsenic poisoning. Dr. Wilson became suspicious and, without informing Emma, took samples of Hall's hair and nails for testing. He sent these to a laboratory in St. Louis, along with samples of food from the Hall household that he had managed to obtain on the pretense of studying the local diet for a medical paper. While waiting for the results, Dr. Wilson began asking discreet questions about Emma's background. A chance conversation with a traveling salesman who had previously worked territories, including several of the communities where Emma had lived, provided the first link in what would become a chain of evidence. The salesman remembered the unlucky widow who had lost multiple husbands across the state. Dr. Wilson's suspicions deepened when he observed Emma's behavior around her ailing husband. She displayed none of the concern one would expect from a loving wife, he later testified. She spoke about his condition with clinical detachment and seemed more irritated by the inconvenience of his lingering illness than worried about his suffering. The laboratory results confirmed Dr. Wilson's suspicions. Henry Hall was suffering from arsenic poisoning. Before he could take this information to the authorities, however, Henry Hall died on April 17, 1895. Emma quickly arranged for his burial, but Dr. Wilson convinced the local sheriff to intervene. Despite Emma's protests, Hall's body was exhumed for autopsy on April 20, 1895. The findings were conclusive. Henry Hall's body contained lethal levels of arsenic. Emma Hall was arrested on April 22, 1895, and charged with the murder of her husband. What followed was one of the most sensational investigations in Missouri history, though one that has been largely forgotten by all but the most dedicated students of criminal history. The arrest of Emma Hall caused an immediate sensation in Shannon County and soon throughout the state. Initially, many locals found it difficult to believe that the respectable Mrs. Hall could be capable of murder. She had been a fixture in the community for nearly 4 years, attending church regularly, participating in ladies' aid societies, and hosting some of the most elegant social gatherings in the county. The idea that this composed, seemingly devoted wife was in fact a cold-blooded killer struck many as impossible. As authorities dug into Emma's past, however, the pattern became clear. Investigators from various counties worked together, exhuming the bodies of her previous husbands where possible. Not all could be located, as Emma had arranged for some to be cremated, an unusual practice for the time. Of the 5 bodies recovered, 4 showed evidence of arsenic poisoning. The 5th, that of Judge Robert Taylor, showed traces of a different poison that experts at the time could not precisely identify. The investigation revealed that Emma had purchased arsenic from different pharmacies across the state over the years, always with the plausible explanation of needing to control rats or other vermin. In an era before centralized record-keeping, these purchases raised no alarms, even when frequent. A pharmacist in Jefferson City recalled that Emma, then Mrs. Wilson, had purchased arsenic multiple times, claiming it was for her husband's medical research. During the investigation, authorities discovered a locked trunk in Emma's bedroom that contained detailed journals dating back to her first marriage. These journals, excerpts of which were read at her trial, revealed a calculating mind obsessed with methodical planning. Emma had documented her husband's declining health in clinical detail, noting which methods were most effective and which created unwanted attention. One entry, dated during her marriage to Dr. Wilson, read, "C. Suspects something amiss with his health. Ironic that his medical knowledge makes him more observant, not less. Must increase dosage gradually. His notes could prove troublesome. Will need to dispose of them when the time comes." Another, written during her marriage to Judge Taylor, stated, "R. complained of the bitter taste in his coffee this morning. We'll switch to the tasteless compound instead. More expensive, but less detectable. His decline should accelerate now, hopefully concluding matters within the month. The St. Louis property must be sold quickly after. Too many of his colleagues nearby who might become suspicious." Perhaps most disturbing were her motivations, as revealed in these private writings. Unlike many who kill for immediate gain, Emma appeared to take a longer view. "Wealth is built slowly, deliberately, like a spider's web," she wrote in one entry from 1887. "Each strand must be carefully placed, each connection secure. Men are merely flies who bring their fortunes to the web. The journals also revealed that Emma's first husband, William Cooper, had indeed been her first victim, not a case of fortuitous natural death, as had been assumed. She described in detached prose how she had started with small doses of arsenic, observing the effects, and gradually increasing until his heart gave out. The first is always the most difficult, she wrote. One lacks experience, confidence. Each subsequent removal becomes more efficient. What emerges from these writings is a portrait of a woman who viewed murder not as an emotional act, but as a business strategy. There was no hatred for her victims, no personal animosity that drove her actions. Instead, she saw them simply as means to an end, stepping stones on her path to financial independence and security. This cold calculation, this complete absence of remorse or emotional involvement, is what many criminologists later found most disturbing about the case. The trial of Emma Hall began on September 10, 1895, in the Shannon County Courthouse in Eminence. It drew spectators from across the state and reporters from as far away as New York and Chicago. The small courthouse was unable to accommodate the crowds, and many stood outside in the late summer heat, waiting for news of each day's proceedings. Emma, now 35 years old, appeared in court dressed in modest black, the picture of a grieving widow. Throughout the proceedings, witnesses noted her remarkable composure, never once showing emotion as the details of her crimes were laid bare. She sat erect, hands folded in her lap, her gaze steady and unblinking, as witness after witness testified against her. The prosecutor, William Harrington, opened the case with a damning overview of Emma's history. "Gentlemen of the jury," he began, "before you sits not just a murderer, but a predator who has stalked the communities of our great state for 15 years. 9 men entered into the sacred covenant of marriage with this woman. 9 men died by her hand. 9 fortunes passed into her possession. This is not a crime of passion or momentary weakness, but a calculated campaign of death for profit." The prosecution presented evidence from multiple jurisdictions, building a case that spanned 15 years and 9 deaths. Former neighbors, household staff, and business associates of her various husbands testified to the pattern of isolation and decline that preceded each death. Medical experts explained the effects of arsenic poisoning, noting how the symptoms could mimic natural illness if administered slowly over time. Dr. Wilson provided particularly compelling testimony, describing in detail his suspicions, investigation, and the scientific evidence of arsenic in Henry Hall's system. The laboratory technician who had conducted the tests on Hall's hair and nail samples also testified, explaining the reliability of the testing methods and the unmistakable presence of the poison. Perhaps the most powerful evidence came from Emma's own journals. The prosecution read selected passages that documented her methodical approach to murder, her clinical observations of her husband's symptoms, and her complete lack of remorse. Many in the courtroom were visibly disturbed by the cold precision of her writings. The defense, led by attorney John Reynolds, faced an uphill battle given the overwhelming evidence against his client. His strategy focused on questioning the reliability of the scientific evidence, suggesting that arsenic was common in many household products and medications of the time and could have entered the victim's systems through innocent means. He also attempted to cast doubt on the authenticity of the journals, suggesting they might have been fabricated or altered to incriminate Emma. Emma's defense was simple. She claimed to be the victim of extraordinary bad luck and a vindictive investigation sparked by distant relatives of her husband's who resented her inheritance. Her attorney argued that the journals were merely the private musings of a woman who had endured tremendous loss and sought to understand the tragedies that had befallen her. "My client has suffered the devastating loss of 9 beloved husbands," defense attorney John Reynolds argued. "Is it any wonder that she might process her grief through writing? These journals are the private thoughts of a woman trying to make sense of repeated tragedy, not confessions of guilt." The defense also attempted to cast doubt on the medical evidence, suggesting that arsenic was common in many household products of the time and could have entered the victim's systems through means other than deliberate poisoning. They pointed out that several of Emma's husbands had been in poor health before marrying her, making them more susceptible to natural illness. Emma herself took the stand, maintaining her innocence throughout a grueling cross-examination. She spoke in a clear, steady voice, expressing appropriate sorrow for the loss of her husbands, but never becoming emotional or flustered, even when confronted with the most damning evidence. She explained away the journals as fictional explorations that helped her cope with her repeated losses, and suggested that her financial acumen was simply a matter of necessity for a woman who had been widowed multiple times. The jury was not convinced. After just 4 hours of deliberation, they returned a guilty verdict on October 3, 1895. Emma Hall was sentenced to hang, one of the few women in Missouri history to receive this sentence. According to newspaper accounts, when the verdict was read, Emma remained as composed as ever, showing no reaction beyond a slight nod of acknowledgment. A reporter from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch described the scene. Mrs. Hall received her sentence with the same unnatural calm that has characterized her throughout the proceedings. While women in the gallery wept and several men turned away, unable to bear the gravity of the moment, the condemned stood perfectly still, her face a mask that revealed nothing of the thoughts behind it. In the months that followed, Emma's case became a sensation across the country. Newspapers dubbed her the Black Widow of the Ozarks and the 9-time widow. Her methodical approach to murder and her apparent lack of remorse fascinated the public and early criminologists alike. The case was discussed in medical journals, legal publications, and popular magazines, with much speculation about what could drive a woman to such calculated violence. Several psychiatrists attempted to interview Emma while she awaited execution, hoping to understand the workings of her mind. She refused most requests, but did speak with Dr. Charles Morton, a pioneer in the emerging field of criminal psychology. Morton's notes, preserved in the archives of Washington University, describe Emma as the most perfectly rational murderer I have encountered. Therein lies the true horror. There is no obvious derangement or defect of reason, simply a complete absence of human empathy. She views people as objects to be utilized, nothing more. Morton's assessment was ahead of its time, foreshadowing later psychological concepts like psychopathy and antisocial personality disorder. He noted that Emma displayed none of the emotional instability or impulsivity often associated with violent criminals. Instead, she exhibited careful planning, emotional detachment, and an ability to blend seamlessly into society while harboring deadly intentions. Emma Hall was scheduled to hang on January 15, 1896. However, 3 days before her execution, she was found dead in her cell. The official report stated that she had somehow obtained a small vial of poison, the same type found in Judge Taylor's system, and taken her own life rather than face the gallows. How she acquired the poison while in custody remains a mystery, though several jailers were subsequently dismissed. Some speculated that Emma had concealed the poison on her person before her arrest, anticipating the possibility of capture. Others suggested that she might have charmed or bribed a guard to smuggle it in. Whatever the means, Emma Hall maintained control until the very end, choosing the time and manner of her death just as she had chosen the deaths of her 9 husbands. A note was found in her cell with just one line, "On my own terms, as always." The handwriting was confirmed to be Emma's. With Emma's death, the case was considered closed. Her substantial fortune, estimated to be equivalent to several $1,000,000 in today's currency, was seized by the state and eventually distributed among the surviving family members of her victims. The journals that had provided such damning evidence were sealed by court order and placed in the state archives, where they remained until being reviewed by researchers in 1940. What makes the case of Emma Hall particularly disturbing is not just the number of her victims, but the patient, methodical manner in which she operated. Unlike more impulsive killers, Emma planned each murder carefully, establishing herself in communities, building trust, and waiting for the right moment. She understood that a young widow might raise suspicions once, but if she changed locations each time, starting fresh where her history was unknown, she could continue indefinitely. Had it not been for Dr. Wilson's European training and awareness of arsenic poisoning symptoms, Emma might have continued her pattern. Indeed, according to documents found among her possessions after her arrest, she had already begun corresponding with potential husband number 10, a wealthy rancher from Colorado. Letters discovered in her personal effects showed that she had been planning to sell the Hall property after an appropriate mourning period and relocate to Colorado, where she would begin the cycle anew. The investigation into Emma's background revealed that her criminal activities may have begun even earlier than her first marriage. During her late teens, while still living with her father, local records show that Thomas Blackwell's behavior became increasingly erratic. Neighbors reported that he would appear confused, forgetting conversations or repeating himself. Some attributed this to his drinking, but in light of later events, investigators speculated that Emma might have been experimenting with poison on her father before using it on her husbands. Thomas Blackwell died in 1879, approximately 1 year before Emma married William Cooper. The cause of death was listed as apoplexy, a term often used for strokes or similar sudden events. No autopsy was performed, and his body was not among those exhumed during the investigation into Emma's crimes. Whether he was her first victim remains a matter of speculation, but the pattern of behavior and the timing suggest it's a possibility that cannot be dismissed. Emma's case is also notable for what it reveals about the society of the time. The mobility and anonymity possible even in the 1880s and 1890s allowed her to reinvent herself repeatedly. The deference shown to widows and the reluctance to question the deaths of older men married to younger women created a perfect environment for her particular methodology. The case also highlights the limitations of law enforcement in an era before fingerprinting, forensic science, and centralized record-keeping. Each jurisdiction operated independently, with little communication between counties or states. A criminal could simply move across county lines and effectively start fresh, their past unknown to their new community. Emma exploited this fragmentation masterfully, ensuring that no one connected the string of deaths until it was almost too late. The case of Emma Hall faded from public memory relatively quickly. By the early 1900s, it was rarely mentioned outside of legal and criminology circles. The sealed journals were briefly reopened during a 1940 study of female serial killers conducted by researchers from Washington University in St. Louis. But the full contents have never been made public. Dr. Margaret Allen, who led the 1940 research team, wrote in her notes, "The Hall journals represent one of the most comprehensive records of a serial killer's thought processes ever documented. The clinical precision, the complete absence of remorse or empathy, and the strategic planning detailed in these pages provide invaluable insights into the criminal mind. However, they are so disturbing in their cold rationality that I cannot recommend their release to the general public." Allen's report noted several patterns in Emma's writings that presaged modern understanding of psychopathic behavior. She observed that Emma never referred to her husbands by name in the private journals, instead using initials or simply the subject. This depersonalization, Allen suggested, allowed Emma to view her victims as objects rather than people, making it easier to carry out her deadly plans without emotional interference. The report also highlighted Emma's obsession with efficiency and improvement. Each murder was analyzed in her journals with notes on what went well and what could be refined in future projects. She documented the progression of symptoms, the effectiveness of different administration methods, and the various financial and legal arrangements that maximized her gain while minimizing suspicion. In 1960, as part of a comprehensive review of historical Missouri criminal cases, several individuals who had peripheral connections to the case were interviewed. These included the niece of Dr. James Wilson, who had preserved some of her uncle's notes on the case, and a former clerk from the Shannon County Courthouse who had been present during the trial. These interviews, along with court records and newspaper accounts, form the basis of what we know about Emma Hall today. Marion Wilson, the niece of Dr. James Wilson, recalled her uncle speaking of the case years later. He said that what haunted him most wasn't the murders themselves, as terrible as they were, but the look in Emma Hall's eyes when she realized he had discovered her secret. He said there was no fear, no panic, just a cold calculation, as if she were already planning her next move. He told me once that he kept his doors locked for years afterward, half expecting some associate of hers to come seeking revenge, though he knew she had acted alone. The courthouse clerk, Herbert Jameson, recalled the unusual atmosphere of the trial. Most murder trials I've witnessed, there's anger, passion, grief, strong emotions on all sides. The Hall trial was different. It was like watching a business dispute being settled. The defendant sat there taking notes during testimony, whispering calmly to her attorney. Even when the most damning evidence was presented, she never flinched. It was unnatural, that composure. The house where Emma and Henry Hall lived still stands, though it has changed hands many times over the decades. Located approximately 7 miles outside of Eminence, near the banks of the Current River, it is now part of a private estate. According to local accounts, several owners have reported unusual cold spots and an overwhelming sense of being watched, particularly in what was once Emma's bedroom. These reports, of course, cannot be verified and may simply be the result of the property's notorious history, coloring the perceptions of those who live there. A former owner, interviewed in 1960, described finding a hidden compartment beneath a floorboard in the master bedroom. Inside was a small tin box containing several locks of hair tied with different colored ribbons. The discovery was so disturbing that the owner resealed the compartment and sold the property soon after. Subsequent owners have either not found the compartment or have chosen not to discuss it publicly. The Hall property, once one of the most prosperous in Shannon County, fell into decline after Emma's arrest and death. With no clear heir, the state managed the estate for several years before eventually selling it at auction. The main house remained, but much of the land was parceled out and sold to different buyers. The tenant farms were abandoned, the sawmill dismantled. Nature gradually reclaimed portions of the once manicured grounds. Today, the house is privately owned and not open to the public. Local tour companies occasionally drive past the entrance gates as part of dark history tours of the region, but respect the current owner's privacy by not lingering or encouraging trespassing. Photographs from the 1960s show a once grand structure beginning to show signs of age and neglect, though more recent images suggest the current owners have undertaken some restoration work. What is perhaps most unsettling about the case of Emma Hall is how easily she moved through society, leaving death in her wake without raising suspicions for so long. In an era before instant communication and centralized record-keeping, a person could effectively start fresh in each new location. Emma exploited this reality with remarkable efficiency. The techniques she used, slow poisoning, isolation of her victims, careful management of her image as a devoted wife, have since been recognized as common tactics among certain types of serial killers. Yet, in the 1880s and early 1890s, few had the framework to connect such disparate deaths across different jurisdictions. A criminology textbook from 1965 describes Emma Hall as a prototype of the organized, methodical killer whose crimes go undetected not because they are particularly clever in their execution, but because the system lacks the infrastructure to recognize the pattern. Hall's case directly influenced the development of cross-jurisdictional information sharing among law enforcement agencies. In fact, several jurisdictions in Missouri began more formal information sharing processes in the wake of the Hall case. recognizing that mobility allowed criminals to exploit the gaps between local law enforcement agencies. While primitive by today's standards, these early efforts at coordination represented an important step in the evolution of modern police work. The case also raises uncomfortable questions about the vulnerability of wealthy men, particularly older ones, to such predation. Each of Emma's husbands was established, respected, and, most importantly, without close family nearby to notice subtle changes in their health or behavior. She selected them carefully, using her status as a widow to appear both respectable and in need of protection, when in fact she was the predator. Modern studies of predatory behavior often cite the Hall case as an example of targeted victim selection. Emma didn't choose victims randomly. She identified specific types of men who met her criteria: wealthy enough to be worth targeting, socially isolated enough that their deaths wouldn't trigger too much scrutiny, and often with health conditions that made a natural death more plausible. In 1968, during renovations to the old Shannon County Courthouse, workers discovered a small space behind a brick in what had been Emma's cell. Inside was a folded piece of paper, preserved in the dry wall cavity. The note, written in what experts confirmed was Emma's handwriting, contained just 7 words. 9 was not enough. I regret nothing. This discovery briefly reignited interest in the case, and several historians speculated that Emma might have had more victims than the 9 husbands identified. Could there have been others before William Cooper, or perhaps victims who weren't husbands at all? The investigation was never reopened, as all potential suspects and victims had long since passed away. But the questions remain. A review of census records and local newspapers from the areas where Emma lived revealed several unexplained deaths of wealthy bachelors or widowers in proximity to her known residences. While circumstantial, these findings suggest the possibility that her true victim count may have been higher than the 9 confirmed cases. Particularly intriguing is the case of Samuel Thornton, a wealthy merchant in Springfield who died suddenly in 1882, shortly before Emma married Joseph Miller. Thornton was found dead in his home, the cause attributed to heart failure. Records indicate that he had recently changed his will to include a substantial bequest to a female acquaintance whose name was not specified in the documents that survive. Whether this woman was Emma remains unknown, but the timing and circumstances align with her methodology. Today, the story of Emma Hall serves as a grim reminder of how a methodical killer could operate in plain sight during a time when communication between jurisdictions was limited and forensic science was in its infancy. Her case has been studied by criminologists interested in female serial killers, who remain statistically rare compared to their male counterparts. Robert Hare, a leading expert on psychopathy, cited the Hall case in a 1967 paper as an example of instrumental predation, murder committed not from emotional impulse, but as a calculated means to an end. The emotional detachment evident in the Hall journals, he wrote, represents a pure form of the psychopathic personality, uncomplicated by the sadistic or sexual components often seen in male serial killers. This observation touches on what many find most disturbing about the Hall case, the complete absence of passion or emotional motivation. Unlike crimes of rage, jealousy, or even sadistic pleasure, Emma's murders appear to have been purely pragmatic, a business strategy carried out with the same detachment one might bring to any financial transaction. This cold calculation challenges our understanding of human nature and the boundaries of moral behavior. The Missouri State Archives still holds the sealed journals and court records from Emma Hall's case. According to those who have been granted limited access to study them, the journals reveal a mind both highly organized and utterly devoid of empathy. Emma viewed her husbands not as human beings, but as stepping stones to wealth and security. The calculated nature of her writings suggests someone who understood exactly what she was doing and felt no remorse for her actions. In one of the final entries, reportedly written just days before Henry Hall began showing symptoms of poisoning, Emma wrote, "The spider has nearly completed her web, 9 strands, each stronger than the last. After this, perhaps rest, perhaps one more. The work is never truly done." This metaphor of the spider and the web appears throughout her writings, suggesting that Emma saw herself not as a murderer, but as a patient predator, simply following her nature. There is no indication in any of her known writings that she ever questioned the morality of her actions or experienced guilt over the lives she had taken. The locations where Emma lived and operated her deadly scheme spanned much of Missouri, from the rolling hills of the Ozarks to the bustling streets of St. Louis and Kansas City. Most of the homes where her husbands died have long since been demolished or repurposed, their dark histories forgotten by all but the most dedicated local historians. In Forsyth, where Emma grew up, the Blackwell family home is long gone, replaced by newer construction. The site of William Cooper's farm near White River was flooded when the Table Rock Dam was constructed in the 1950s, burying whatever secrets might have remained there beneath the waters of Table Rock Lake. The Springfield Dry Goods store, once owned by Joseph Miller, operated under different management until the early 1900s, when it was converted to a hardware store. That building was demolished in the 1940s to make way for more modern commercial development. In Joplin, the boarding house Emma operated briefly still stands, though it has been divided into apartments, and few of its current residents are aware of its connection to one of Missouri's most notorious killers. Perhaps it is fitting that the physical locations of Emma's crimes have largely disappeared or transformed over time. Like the memories of those who knew her, they have faded, leaving behind only fragments of a story that seems almost too calculated to be real. Yet the courthouse records, newspaper accounts, and sealed journals confirm that Emma Hall was very real indeed. Her methodical approach to murder, her patience, and her complete lack of remorse make her one of the most disturbing killers in American history, even if her name is not as well known as others who came later. The story of Emma Hall serves as a reminder that evil often wears a conventional face, that the most dangerous predators may be those who blend seamlessly into society rather than standing apart from it. In an era when women were generally viewed as the gentler sex, incapable of calculated violence, Emma exploited gender expectations to avoid suspicion and gain access to her victims. As we conclude this examination of the Emma Hall case, we are left with the unsettling reality that some predators move among us undetected, their true nature hidden behind a carefully constructed facade of normalcy. Emma's story serves as a reminder that evil often doesn't announce itself with dramatic gestures or obvious malice, but rather with quiet calculation and infinite patience. The 9 men who married Emma Hall could not have known what awaited them. Each believed he had found companionship with a respectable widow who had suffered loss and sought a new beginning. None suspected that their new wife had orchestrated those very losses, or that they were simply the next strand in her web. In the end, justice caught up with Emma Hall, as it often does with those who take the lives of others. Yet one cannot help but wonder how many more might have fallen victim to her calculated scheme had Dr. Wilson not recognized the symptoms of arsenic poisoning and taken action. How long might her deadly pattern have continued in an era when communication between jurisdictions was limited and forensic science was still developing? The cold case of Emma Hall, the killer widow of the Ozarks, reminds us that sometimes the most dangerous predators are those who appear completely ordinary, those whose patience and planning allow them to operate in plain sight for years before anyone connects the deadly pattern they leave behind. The next time you pass through the quiet towns of the Missouri Ozarks, consider that some stories remain whispered rather than shouted, buried in archives rather than featured in history books. Some horrors are too methodical, too calculating to capture the public imagination in the way that more sensational crimes might. Yet, in many ways, it is precisely this calculated nature that makes them truly terrifying. For the 9 men who married Emma Hall between 1880 and 1895, the horror was not in dramatic confrontation or sudden violence, but in the slow, methodical poisoning administered by the hand they trusted most. Perhaps that is why her story continues to disturb those who study it, even more than a century after her crimes were finally discovered. The case files gathered dust in the Missouri State Archives until 1968, when they were briefly re-examined following the discovery of Emma's final note. Since then, they have been accessed only rarely by researchers with specific permission. The journals themselves, with their clinical documentation of murder, remain sealed to the general public, their contents known only through the excerpts shared during the trial and subsequent research. Perhaps it is better this way. Some methodologies of murder are best left unstudied by the general public. The calculated efficiency with which Emma Hall dispatched 9 husbands and accumulated their wealth represents a particular kind of evil, patient, deliberate, and utterly without remorse. The legacy of Emma Hall lives on primarily in criminology textbooks and specialized studies of female serial killers, where her case is often cited as an early example of a Black Widow killer, a woman who murders multiple spouses for financial gain. Yet even among this rare category of criminal, Emma stands out for the number of her victims, the duration of her killing career, and the meticulous documentation she kept of her crimes. In a macabre footnote to the case, it was discovered during the investigation that Emma had kept small mementos from each husband: a watch fob, a cufflink, a tie pin. These items were found carefully wrapped and labeled in a small wooden box, hidden in a compartment in her traveling trunk. Such trophies are now recognized as common among certain types of serial killers, though at the time investigators were puzzled by the collection. Some local folklore has grown up around the Hall case over the decades. In Eminence and other communities where Emma lived, parents once warned misbehaving children that the widow Hall might come for them if they didn't behave. Ghost stories about Emma's spirit haunting the old Hall property circulate among teenagers and around campfires. While such tales have little connection to the historical reality of the case, they speak to the way in which Emma Hall entered the cultural consciousness of the region as an embodiment of patient, calculating evil. As night falls over the Ozark Mountains and the winding Current River reflects the moonlight, one might imagine Emma Hall still watching, still calculating, her methods echoing through time to remind us that sometimes the most dangerous predators are those who look exactly like everyone else.